On Sunday, March 10th, 2019, at 8:44 in the morning, a nearly new Boeing 737 MAX 8 took off from Addis Ababa. On board were 157 people headed for Nairobi. Minutes after leaving the ground, this brand new jet started behaving in ways that no training could have prepared the crew for. 50 kilometers east-southeast of Addis Ababa Bole Airport, something went catastrophically wrong. The pilots, seasoned professionals, found themselves locked in a desperate fight for control against an unseen force. What could make a state-of-the-art airliner suddenly turn so violently against its own crew moments into a flight? I'm Captain James Harlow. I've spent 28 years in commercial aviation analyzing accidents from the flight deck perspective. Every time I look at a case like this, I don't just see a tragedy. I see what the crew saw. I feel the controls in my hands. Welcome aboard. Let me tell you who these people were. On board that Boeing 737 MAX 8, tail number ETAVJ, were 157 people from more than 35 countries. This wasn't just another flight. Many were aid workers, UN staff, and environmental delegates headed to a major UN Environment Assembly. Take Pius Adesanmi, a prominent Nigerian-Canadian professor and author known for his sharp commentary. He was traveling to a conference. Or Joanna Toole, a 36-year-old British conservationist passionate about protecting marine life, on her way to contribute to global environmental policy. And Anne-Katrine Fecker, a 30-year-old German aid worker with the World Food Programme, bringing hope to vulnerable communities. These were people with plans, families, purposes, their lives intersecting on that particular morning. The aircraft itself, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, was almost brand new. Delivered to Ethiopian Airlines just the previous year in 2018, this MAX 8 had logged only 1,330 hours of flight time across 382 flights. This wasn't an aging workhorse. It was a modern machine powered by advanced CFM iLEAP-1B engines, designed to be more fuel-efficient and technologically sophisticated. In the cockpit, Captain Yared Getachew, 29 years old, was a highly respected pilot. He had logged over 8,000 hours of flight time, a significant amount of experience for someone in the left seat. He was thoroughly trained on the 737 MAX. Alongside him was First Officer Ahmed Nur Mohammed, 25 years old, with about 200 hours on the MAX type and 1,500 hours total flight time. He was on his way to visit family in Nairobi. Captain Getachew was leading the flight, guiding the younger First Officer Mohammed. They were a team, relying on their training, their checklists, and the predictable behavior of an aircraft designed for safety. This was Ethiopian Airlines, operating from a familiar airport with a solid reputation. But what nobody knew, what no training could have prepared them for, was a hidden anomaly within this cutting-edge aircraft. Think of a perfectly engineered car that under certain specific conditions might suddenly decide to steer itself sharply to one side without driver input. That's what was lurking within the advanced systems of the 737 MAX 8. The pilots had no indication their new aircraft carried such a dangerous, undisclosed characteristic. That's where it all went wrong. The morning of March 10th, 2019 began like any other at Addis Ababa Bole Airport. The weather was clear, operations were normal, and Flight 302 was cleared for departure. Captain Getachew and First Officer Mohammed completed their pre-flight checks, confirming every system on their nearly new MAX 8 was ready. The 157 occupants settled into their seats for the short journey to Nairobi. At 8:38 and 33 seconds, the CFM iLEAP-1B engines spooled up, and ETAVJ began its takeoff roll. The climb-out was routine at first. The aircraft lifted off the runway at 8:38 and 58 seconds, accelerating through its initial climb profile. For seasoned pilots, this is practice procedure. Then, just over 1 minute into the flight, at 8:40 and 4 seconds, something went profoundly wrong. The aircraft's nose began to pitch down. This wasn't pilot input. This was the initial manifestation of a system called MCAS, the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. The MAX had larger, more fuel-efficient engines mounted further forward on the wing. This design change could cause the aircraft's nose to pitch up too aggressively during high angle of attack maneuvers. Boeing designed MCAS to automatically push the nose down, trimming the aircraft to make the MAX fly like previous 737 models. It was supposed to be a subtle background system, reacting only to specific flight parameters. The problem was that MCAS relied on a single angle of attack sensor. If that sensor failed and sent bad data, MCAS would mistakenly believe the aircraft was pitching up dangerously when it wasn't. It would push the nose down repeatedly with increasing force against the pilot's commands. In the cockpit, Captain Getachew and First Officer Mohammed immediately felt the unexpected nose-down input. They were experiencing a runaway stabilizer trim, an uncontrolled movement of the horizontal stabilizer affecting the aircraft's pitch. They pulled back on their control columns, fighting to raise the nose and maintain their climb. The stick shaker, an alarm vibrating the control column to warn of an impending stall, activated at 8:40 and 22 seconds, based on faulty angle of attack data, adding to the confusion. The aircraft's pitch and vertical speed became erratic. The ground proximity warning system issued an urgent, don't sink," warning at 8:41 and 5 seconds. The crew was fighting for control, trying to apply the established procedures for a runaway trim. At 8:41 and 22 seconds, the pilots correctly identified the runaway trim and executed the stabilizer trim cutout procedure. They cut power to the electric trim system, including MCAS, attempting to stop the nose-down commands. For a brief moment it seemed to work. The aircraft's pitch stabilized, and the pilots were able to manually trim using the trim wheel. They were climbing again, regaining altitude, pushing toward nearly 9,000 feet. In that moment, they would have felt relief, believing they'd tamed the problem. But nobody knew this was a fight against a system designed to be relentless. Just 43 seconds later, at 8:42 and 5 seconds, the captain re-engaged the electric trim system. Whether to reduce the intense manual effort required, or as a troubleshooting step, this decision proved fatal. The faulty sensor immediately reactivated MCAS. The nose-down commands returned with even greater force. The aircraft's pitch dropped rapidly. Captain Getachew and First Officer Mohammed pulled with all their strength on the control columns, trying to counteract the powerful automated trim. The physical exertion was immense, the forces on the controls nearing the limits of human strength. The control column forces recorded by the flight data recorder indicate a desperate struggle. Initially, investigators including the AAIB Ethiopia faced a perplexing scene. They considered engine failure, sabotage, even a bird strike. Initial reports from the ground describing smoke and strange noises fueled various theories. But the flight data recorders would tell a different, chilling story, one of an automated system operating beyond the pilot's understanding and control. At 8:43 and 2 seconds, the aircraft began a terrifying, uncontrolled dive. The rate of descent spiked dramatically, exceeding 5,000 feet per minute. Inside the cabin, the 157 people would have been thrown against their seatbelts, the sensation like a roller coaster plunging downwards, only far more violent and sustained. The silence after the brief stabilization shattered by alarms and the roar of the wind. The pilots were at their absolute limit. The aircraft pitched so aggressively it reached angles never intended for commercial flight. The airframe was under extreme stress. Speed increased rapidly, approaching 450 knots, well beyond safe operating limits for such a low altitude. The alarms blared. Overspeed, overspeed, sink rate, pull up. The control column was being pulled back with maximum effort, but the powerful nose-down trim from MCAS was overwhelming their input. They were fighting something invisible, an unseen hand on the controls pushing them toward the Earth. At 8:43 and 26 seconds, the aircraft reached just 820 feet above the ground. The final recorded data showed the aircraft's nose pointing sharply downward, accelerating with devastating speed. The flight crew had fought valiantly, applying every technique they knew, but against a persistent automated system acting on erroneous data, their training and experience were tragically insufficient. At 8:44, the 737 MAX 8 with tail number ET-AVJ impacted the ground 50 kilometers east-southeast of Addis Ababa Bole Airport. There was no time for a final distress call, just a sudden, violent end to 157 lives. The impact created a deep crater scattering debris over a wide area. Devastation, then silence. The world outside the windscreen becomes a terrifying blur, a green and brown canvas rushing up with impossible speed. Inside the cockpit, Captain Getachew and First Officer Mohammed pull back on the control columns with every ounce of strength. Their faces are strained, muscles rigid, but the columns stay fixed, held by the relentless erroneous system. Alarms shriek, overspeed, and sink rate, pull up, each one a desperate warning already too late. Air screams past the fuselage, a deafening roar vibrating through every fiber of the aircraft. The aircraft shudders in violent protest against the impossible aerodynamic forces tearing at its structure. In the cabin, 157 souls experience their final moments. The initial lurch downward has become a sustained, brutal plunge. Passengers are pinned against their seatbelts, then momentarily lifted as the aircraft pitches violently. Screams are swallowed by the roar. Loose objects become projectiles. The light outside the windows darkens, not with night, but with the aircraft's own shadow, as it falls faster than sound. Then, the ground fills the view, an inescapable, unyielding target. A blinding flash of light, an unimaginable concussive force. Then, nothing. In those final seconds, there was no physical way to recover. Even if the pilots had the presence of mind to try the manual trim wheel again, the sheer aerodynamic forces at such extreme speed and angle of attack would have made it impossible to turn. The aircraft was operating so far outside its normal envelope that physics alone made recovery impossible. Their valiant struggle, recorded by the flight data recorder, was a testament to their training and dedication, but it was a fight against an invisible opponent that had already won. Within minutes, dust and smoke attract attention. Local farmers are the first to approach, cautiously, then with dawning horror. The raw, fresh wound in the earth. The profound silence, broken only by wind and eventually distant sirens. News of the missing flight spreads through air traffic control, to Ethiopian Airlines operations, and finally to families waiting in Nairobi. The initial hope that always clings to a delayed flight gave way to devastating certainty. The AAIB, Ethiopia, was notified. Their grim task: secure the impact site, begin collecting evidence, locate the flight recorders. Now we have to look at the core of the technical problem, the design of the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, or MCAS. This system was introduced to make the new 737 MAX 8 fly like its predecessors, despite having larger engines that changed its aerodynamic characteristics. The fundamental problem was that MCAS relied on input from a single angle of attack sensor. In aviation, redundancy is a golden rule, especially for systems that directly influence the flight controls. If one component is critical, there should always be a backup. Here, if that single sensor malfunctioned and sent bad data, MCAS would activate, believing the aircraft was pitching up excessively when it wasn't. It would then command the horizontal stabilizer to push the nose down, repeatedly, aggressively, and powerfully against the pilot's control inputs. This single point of failure was a fundamental design flaw that created an invisible lethal adversary in the cockpit. Second, the lack of comprehensive pilot training and awareness regarding MCAS was critical. Captain Getachew and First Officer Mohammed were thoroughly trained on the 737 MAX, but they, like most pilots globally, were not fully informed about MCAS's specific characteristics and failure modes. Boeing intended for MCAS to operate subtly in the background, without requiring specific pilot training. When the system began pushing the nose down, the crew correctly initiated the standard runaway stabilizer trim procedure, which involves cutting the electric trim. This worked briefly. However, they had no specific training or guidance on MCAS's relentless nature, or how to manage the incredibly high forces required to manually control the aircraft at increasing speeds once electric trim was disengaged. Nobody was told about it in detail. Third, and most agonizing, was the impossible situation created by the physical demands of flying manually and the consequence of re-engaging electric trim. After the initial MCAS activation, the crew correctly cut electric trim, regaining some control. But the manual trim wheel requires immense physical effort to operate, especially at increasing airspeeds. Captain Getachew, in an attempt to alleviate this incredible workload and perhaps troubleshoot, re-engaged the electric trim system. For a pilot, re-engaging an electric system to see if it functions normally after an interruption is a logical troubleshooting step in many scenarios. However, because the faulty angle of attack sensor was still sending erroneous data, re-engaging electric trim immediately reactivated MCAS with even greater force. The aerodynamic forces on the horizontal stabilizer at the aircraft's speed made it nearly impossible to overcome MCAS manually, even with maximum effort. It was a vicious cycle. The crew fought the system, found temporary relief, then in trying to restore normal operations, unwittingly handed control back to the very system trying to kill them. This wasn't a failure of pilot skill, but a tragic interplay between an undocumented system, a faulty sensor, and the immense physical limits of human control. The investigation by the AAIB Ethiopia, with extensive international technical assistance, unveiled a profound truth. MCAS was operating on erroneous data from a single faulty angle of attack sensor. This system repeatedly commanded the aircraft's nose to pitch down, overwhelming the flight crew's valiant efforts to regain control. The core discovery was a critical design flaw, a safety-critical system relying on a single point of failure without sufficient redundancy and without pilots being fully aware of its power or failure modes. This tragedy, following a similar accident 5 months prior, led to the worldwide grounding of all Boeing 737 MAX aircraft on March 13, 2019. It forced a fundamental reevaluation of how automated systems are designed, certified, and communicated to flight crews. The most significant outcome was a mandatory software update for MCAS, requiring it to utilize input from 2 angle of attack sensors and limiting its activation to a single pilot resettable event. The Federal Aviation Administration codified this through Airworthiness Directive 2020-08-01, issued in June 2020, alongside significantly enhanced pilot training requirements, including simulator sessions simulating these failure modes. These changes, directly born from the 157 lives lost on Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, have since prevented any recurrence of this lethal malfunction, fundamentally altering the safety landscape for this aircraft type and all future aircraft designs. This case comes down to a moment of impossible choices under unimaginable pressure. For those of you who know the cockpit or study these events with intensity, I want to ask directly, in that critical moment after Captain Getachew successfully cut electric trim and was facing incredible physical demands of manually controlling the aircraft at high speed, would you have made the call to re-engage electric trim, hoping to restore normal operations? Or would you have committed to manually flying the aircraft to a safe landing, no matter the effort? It's a question of human instinct versus unconfirmed system behavior, and there's no easy answer. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Building this channel and sharing these stories from the flight deck is something I'm passionate about. If you find value in these detailed breakdowns and appreciate the insider perspective, please give this video a like. It helps more people find this channel. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing. It's free and takes 2 seconds, and it ensures you won't miss our next deep dive into aviation safety. Or, if you want to support us further, consider becoming a member. Your support helps us invest in the research and visuals needed to bring these critical lessons to life. Most importantly, I want to hear your thoughts on that tough question. Your experience and perspective make this community valuable. Thank you for being here.